Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this next session and for being part of today's virtual leadership conference. I'm Eric Ginsberg. I'm part of CCL's social media team. I work closely with Emily, who you've been seeing in these other sessions. She just had a great coaching session with Andre. If you missed that, I recommend you go back and check out the recording. For this session, I'll be talking with our senior faculty, Abigail Dunne about the importance of empathy and inclusion. And as part of this conversation, we'll be exploring 7 ways you and your organization can use empathy and inclusion to reinvent you and your organization during the crises that we're experiencing, which we'll also discuss. Before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this session, like all of the other sessions today, will be available. There will be a recording right here in the event. So if you need to step away or you can't stay for the whole time, just know that you can come back and catch all of Abigail's insights later. And of course, as we go, please feel free to drop any questions or comments below, and we'll do our best to answer those at the end. So again, thank you all for tuning in. And Abigail, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. To kick things off, do you want to begin by introducing yourself and letting folks in on our focus for today?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I've been anxiously, in a good way, anticipating this conversation because it's such a powerful concept that is not talked about as much as it should be. So thank you so much for inviting me. Just a little bit about myself. I am the senior faculty at the Center for Creative Leadership in the Societal Advancement Group. And in the Societal Advancement Group, we have clients in several sectors: in K through 12, higher ed, nonprofit, and also in population health, which is where I sit. Even though I do dabble a little bit in all the other sectors because I like variety. I have been consulting for more than 20 years, mainly for Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies in a variety of different industries, from pharma to manufacturing to telecommunications. But I found my home in societal advancement, where I do work in rural areas and everywhere from Africa. And this year I'll be going to India. So I love the work that I do.
Perfect. And then do you mind just framing the conversation that we're going to be having a little bit today, letting folks know what we'll be talking through and why it's relevant?
So today we're going to focus primarily on empathy and inclusion, topics that seem sort of soft and squishy and not really tangible. And what I'm going to do today is make it tangible for you in the context of crisis and also in the context of equity, diversity, and inclusion. We put in the title the word reinvention. Because what I'm proposing here is that when we invest ourselves in understanding and practicing empathy and inclusion, that it can help us, catapult us, encourage us to reinvent ourselves, which is absolutely what most of us want at this point in the middle of several crises that we're experiencing.
Perfect. And just to add a little bit of context, let's dive into what those crises are. I mean, I don't think this will surprise our audience. I think people are pretty aware of what we're discussing, but just make sure that we provide them with some more specifics. Would you like to talk through sort of what those 2 main challenges are that we're describing?
So I'm going to mention the 2 main challenges, which everybody knows. But the truth of the matter is that crises can come at any time, anywhere. They typically don't make an appointment with you, right? So keep that in mind in the larger context. But of course, we'll be talking about several examples that relate to COVID-19 and several examples as it relates to the murder of Black men.
Thank you. I think I just want to make sure that people are on the same page that we are, and sort of frame the powerful and important things that we'll be addressing in this conversation. One of the things that you and I talked about when we were preparing for this conversation was sort of how this moment brings together an overlap of these crises, and then empathy and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, those aren't words they're used to hearing or thinking about together. Can you help us understand the interrelationship between these three terms?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I will. Just like you said, crises, empathy, and inclusion typically aren't held together. But before I do that, I want to talk about what happens when empathy and inclusion go awry. I sort of want to put that to the side so that we can then focus in on how powerful they can be when they work well. And so, many of us have great intentions when we want to be empathic or when we want to act with inclusion. But there are some unintended consequences, and some people might even call it collateral damage. And so the first one of those is tokenism. What happens here is that we intend to be inclusive, but we're only partially inclusive. So we will pick one Black person to come into our organization, or we'll pick one woman or one person who's LGBTQ, as if that is the minimum requirement of us being inclusive. And of course, that backfires on us. Because we don't have a substantial enough representation of that population to really benefit from the diversity that they bring. Also, frequently those individuals who are tokens feel awkward because they know they're tokens. And it's clear that they're only there to really check a box. And so that is one of the unintended consequences that we want to avoid. Secondarily, we have assimilation. And that is when an individual basically takes on the characteristics and the values of the organization that they are working for. They are working in an organization that is a dominant culture, and their culture is not the dominant culture. And so what happens is that they then lose their personality, their values, their unique value added in order to fit in to this organization. An organization that has the intention of being inclusive, but has this unintended consequences. The third unintended consequence that I want to talk about is dehumanization. And probably the most powerful and painful form of this is when an individual who is quote unquote diverse is brought into an organization and is treated as if they don't have the same level of intelligence as their privileged colleagues. And this is a form of dehumanizing in terms of dehumanizing on the intellectual level. Again, a semblance of inclusion, but the impact or the collateral damage of dehumanization. And what does that do? Of course, the individual never reaches their potential. The organization loses, the individual loses. Other people in the organization are observing this, and it impacts the organizational climate. So I just wanted to get those out of the way so that I can say that the kind of empathy and inclusion that I'm going to talk about is not the kind that is going to produce these unintended consequences. It's the kind that is going to take these unintended consequences into consideration so that we can deliberately engage in acts of inclusion that are going to accelerate and invigorate the organization to the point of reinvention.
Thank you for framing that. I think it's so important for people to remember that there is this gap between what an organization's intention may be, and then the way that they carry that out can have this collateral damage that you spoke to. Just want to remind folks that there will be a recording of this that you can watch afterwards. If you need to revisit what Abigail just laid out, you can do that at a later point. But now I know that we want to move towards exactly what you said, these 7 acts of inclusion and how organizations and individuals can get this right. So as organizations and individuals who are committed to successfully merging this empathy and inclusion and accelerating that as a organizational or individual transformation. Let's talk about those 7 acts of inclusion. I know we have a slide here. There we go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. What I want to underscore before I start is the word reinvention. We put that word there purposefully because when you're in a crisis, you don't have time to fool around. You don't have time to worry about what is not going to meet your most immediate need. And so we put reinvention there because, again, reinvention can cause you to regenerate, to build something new. And it can also cause you to accelerate that building of something new. And so that is the frame of mind that I want you to be in as we explore these acts of inclusion. I was pondering them today, and I said, if I were teaching this to my 10-year-old son, what would I say? And I would tell him these are superpowers. And that's how I want you to think about these acts of inclusion, that each and every single one of these acts of inclusion have changed lives, have opened doors, have built bridges between countries. And so I offer them to you again as a reminder that as an individual and as an organization, you can absolutely engage in any of these acts and see the benefits of them. All right, should we dig in, Eric?
Yes, thank you so much for that framing and context to sort of ground us as we begin. But let's start with the first one.
All right, so the first one is self-awareness. I'm sure you're not surprised that I'm starting here because, you is where the buck stops, and you are the one that you have most control over. The main thing to glean from this is that you have to know yourself. You have to be comfortable in your own skin in order for you to be able to engage in acts of inclusion. When you're uncomfortable with yourself and you haven't built your self-confidence, you'll find that it will reverberate down all of the 7 acts that we're going to propose today. So the first thing is to build a solid foundation. That is the first act of inclusion, which is include yourself. So that's the first one. The second one kind of grows out of this, which is foster social awareness. Now, you might ask why? Well, social awareness is the currency of dialogue. It's the currency of our relationship with other people. And so some people are impoverished in this regard. They're ill-equipped to communicate with people. They say things that are inappropriate at the wrong times. And in some societies, they might accuse you of being improperly socialized. In other words, you have no idea what's going on around you. And so what we're saying by an act of inclusion is pay attention to what's going on around you and use that information to build a culture of inclusion. Simple. You have a new person in your organization. Instead of leaving them in their office, go over, find out how they are, find out a little bit about them, show them around, offer to help them find a new dentist, a new doctor, a new carpenter, whatever it is that they need. In our organization, we have one particular gentleman. He has a list that's ready and prepared for every new person that comes into the organization. Simple acts of inclusion that can absolutely change the culture of your organization. And so let's see, what else do we have here? We have reveal blind spots. And this is where I'm going to get a little bit more into the crises that we talked about a little earlier.
Perfect.
So what shocked and in some case traumatized us as a country was seeing George Floyd murdered in front of our very eyes. Before the days of cameras on our phones, we would never have seen that. But almost everybody you will talk to who saw that clip said it completely changed them. Mm-hmm. So what happened? What happened was a new piece of information pierced the curtain of their blind spot. And that information then caused them to think differently, to feel differently, to act differently. And so what ended up happening, we had several people that was experiencing that, and we had an explosion of moral outrage. And that explosion reverberated across the globe. That's what can happen when you enable yourself to gain new information, so that that information can absolutely cause you to reinvent yourself. So what is the act of inclusion there? The act of inclusion is exposure. Expose yourself to new information, expose yourself to new people, expose yourself to new challenges. And as a result, what will happen is the way you think and the way you act will be reinvented.
That's really poignant, and I'm grateful for you bringing it back to why we're really having this conversation today. I see that next is Listen to Understand, which I know our colleague Andre spoke to a little bit in the previous session. And in case folks missed it or aren't familiar with that framing, how does that relate to inclusion, and what do you mean by Listen to Understand?
Andre is one of my favorite people as the coaching head at CCL. I love the idea of listening to understand. Very simple idea, very powerful idea. And when you learn it in our program, Better Conversations Every Day, what you are taught to listen for are three fundamental things. First of all, facts, feelings, and values. Facts, feelings, and values. The example I want to give you is a hospital system that wanted to establish a telehealth practice in a rural area with high incidence of prostate cancer. And so, of course, they put a top-notch program together, executed it with brilliance, and can you even imagine that the program absolutely failed abysmally? Mm-hmm. And so, of course, they went back to the drawing board, and part of what they did was they had conversations, and they collected facts, they collected feelings, and they collected values. And what did they discover? They discovered the fact is that the men in that particular community had no value for telehealth. They didn't have a relationship with the doctor. The doctor couldn't speak their language, and then he was communicating with them through a screen. Absolutely unheard of, and no cultural context. The other thing is that the healing system from the hospital was competing with a cultural healing system. Nobody ever addressed that, so there was no confidence that the healing system from the hospital was going to add any value. And then another issue that's a little bit more subtle but very profound is that their privacy value was very different from the privacy value of the hospital's culture. And as a result, the way that the doctor approached them, the way that the equipment was basically placed in the community was completely counter to the culture of the environment. And many of these men didn't even discuss their health issues with their wives or their children. So why would they do that with a doctor that they didn't know? And so the hospital took all of this into consideration. They listened to understand, and they made adjustments to their program, and they were able to turn it around to something very, very meaningful and successful. Listening is a powerful tool.
It's a very helpful example, and I hope that audience, everyone that's tuned in, can understand, the point that we're making here. To me, create connection sounds pretty straightforward, but I know that there's more to it than just what appears on the surface. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yes. When I think about creating connections, I ask the question, for what purpose? And I'm reminded of Anwar Sadat's wife speaking at Wellesley College's graduation. And she was complaining that her husband was too generous. And Anwar Sadat turned around to his wife and said, "Stop complaining. I'm leaving you a legacy of friends." Mm-hmm. Put differently, I'm leaving you a legacy of connections that you will be able to use to get whatever it is that you need in the future, or help that you might need in the future. And so I call that social capital. Mm-hmm. And so are you building your social capital so that you'll have what you need when you need it? The example I'm going to give here is this COVID-19. Everybody was running around for toilet paper. They were running around for hand sanitizer. They were running around for canned foods. And they were helter-skelter looking for everything. Well, I live in a small community here. I know my neighbors. I know their name. And we were taking care of each other throughout. If somebody didn't feel like cooking dinner, well, they came to my house and got their dinner and went back home. Or I'd leave it on their doorstep. So that's just a small example of how you can survive crises when you actually band together. Let's blow that up. There's a lot of talk about ventilators and how states are going to purchase ventilators. We see some states being lone rangers, and we see some states banding together, maximizing their economies of scale so that they can take care of their people. That's, again, connections at a bigger, wider level, but you get the point. The other point I want to make about social capital is this. Those who study social networks talk about how important it is to have a diverse social network. One, because you'll get information from many different sources, perspectives from many different sources, and especially in a crisis, you need that. The other thing is that diverse social networks expand your capacity to deal with differences. In other words, making you more clever, more intelligent, more flexible, with greater agility. And just like you want your portfolio to be diversified, you also ought to have your social capital to be diversified.
That's a great example. So let's talk about the importance of vulnerability and courage. I know that when we were talking through this beforehand, this is one of my favorite items on the list, just because of the way that you laid out its importance. And so talk to us about the importance of this.
This is the one that kind of gets to your core. Because when we're talking about vulnerability, we're talking about areas where we feel weak. And then we're saying, we want you to position yourself in the area where you feel weak, and we want you to do it courageously. It feels like it's an oxymoron. But in actual fact, when we think about it as a powerful act of inclusion, as a superpower, there's something magical that happens when you put courage and vulnerability together. Mm-hmm. And so I was reminded of my experience early on in my career. I am a Black woman, and in my organization was a Latina woman. And this woman worked tirelessly. She was extremely committed in all that she did. And year in, year out, I saw her work hard, but not get promoted.
Mm.
And I was just, I was, oh, I can't even find words for it. But I didn't do anything.
Mm.
You know, all I felt was I felt for her, but I did nothing. Eventually, I said to myself, you have to do something. Of course, I felt vulnerable as another minority in the organization. I really felt like I didn't have a voice. But the truth of the matter was that I did. And so I faced my vulnerability, I faced it courageously, and then I spoke up and gave my organization an opportunity to appreciate this valuable asset that they had in this individual. Well, you would imagine that right away I'd get results. It took 3 times
Wow.
before she was eventually promoted. But every time I had to swallow and kind of undergird myself up with courage. But that incessant courage, that repeated vulnerability with courage eventually produced results.
Mm. I just want to hold the power of the story you shared and make space for people to sit with that, because I think it's a really, for me, it's a really helpful reminder that this isn't necessarily an easy road. Even organizations that say that they're committed to these things, this is, your experience is not uncommon, and that even if you have the vulnerability, that it takes that extra level of courage to, because you may and likely will be met with resistance.
Yes,
So just
yes. So let me give you a more current example. We at the Center for Creative Leadership, one of our clients is the Association of State and Territorial Health Officers, and it's called ASTO. And the state and territorial health officers are the senior most health officer in each state. Right now, their hands are full.
I'm sure.
And all of us know that nobody has the answer to the issues that we're facing right now. So as the senior most health officer, people expect you to have answers.
Yeah.
And so in this moment, you have an opportunity to courageously and vulnerably let them know that I don't have all the answers. I'm willing to work hard to provide as many answers as I have, but I don't have all the answers. That's another form of courageous vulnerability, not having to pretend that you know everything.
Yeah, thank you for that example. I'm sure that there are some people that are now thinking about moments in their own life, either something in the past or present, where they faced a similar situation.
Yes.
So last here on this list, we have investing resources, which I know, of course, is an essential part of this equation, an essential part of inclusion. Can you walk us through what exactly we mean by that?
Thanks for asking that question. I like to bring this up because inclusion seems to be sort of like an altruistic act. People imagine that it's free. Well, it's not. Anytime that you commit to an act of inclusion, it's going to cost you something. Now, it may not cost you cash, it may just cost you time, but time is money. And so it's very important, I think, for organizations and even individuals who want to engage in an act of inclusion to take their pencils out, take their laptop out, and do some numbers and decide for yourself, is this something that I can afford? Is this something that is strategic for me? Because what you typically want to do is engage in acts of inclusion that are going to be worthwhile and then and that are going to be successful. And so you don't want to engage in an act of inclusion that is not successful. Prime example, I had a client and they decided they were going to build a daycare center. Well, most of their employees were over 50.
Okay.
And the last I checked, there aren't too many women who are planning on having babies 50 plus, right? There are some, but probably not enough to fill a daycare center.
Mm.
That was an example of an act of inclusion that wasn't well thought through. They could have had a voucher program. They could have done any number of things other than investing in a building that wasn't going to be used.
Mm.
Right. So think about now wheelchair accessibility. Okay. Should we invest in that? Well, a lot of people say, well, it's a waste. But without realizing that it is an essential part, not only for the employees, but also for the clients. And so, again, it is easy to have an eye on cutting something that you really should invest in and then investing in things that you shouldn't. So all I'm doing here is bringing it to your attention that inclusion costs and that you should do it with prudence.
One thing that you said earlier this week to me is that there's also a cost of exclusion that people often don't think about.
You are right on the spot. And many times people don't think about that. So if we go back to some of the unintended consequences, and let's say you employ somebody as a token, one of, what typically happens? Usually that one person gets, every time that the organization needs the token to be a representative of something, that individual gets called all the time.
Mm.
And also they might get ignored all the time.
Right.
Because they're one of a kind. You can just kind of forget that person in the corner office. And so you need to understand that every time that you are not optimizing each individual that works in your organization, that you're losing money.
Mm. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So I do see we have some questions coming in that I want to make time for at the end. But before we get to questions, and please, if you're watching and you have some, keep commenting. We will read through those. But first, a big part of this equation is empathy. And empathy plays an important role in inclusion and also transforming your organization or reinventing your organization. Can you just tell us a little bit about how empathy fits into all of this, or what role it plays?
To me, empathy is the prized possession of everything that we're talking about. It is the foundation of everything we're talking about. And it is simply the capacity to be able to connect with another human being on an emotional level without necessarily trying to change them, heal them, do anything to them other than just what Henry Nouwen talks about, which is just being in their presence. And so that's the essence of what we mean by empathy. And so the question is, under what circumstances can we experience that?
Mm.
I myself experienced it under very moving circumstances. I was sick. I was in an emergency room. And we do Physicians Leadership Academy also with our hospital here in Greensboro. And it was one of the physicians that I had taught in my class. So he greeted me, of course, I greeted him, and he sat with me for about maybe 3 or 4 minutes and said nothing. And after that 3 and 4 minutes, he was very present. He said, "How can I help you?"
Mm.
He didn't ask how he could help me before he had made an empathic connection with me. And it was powerful, absolutely powerful. And so that's what I want us to begin to think. Where do we have opportunities to demonstrate that kind of empathy? As I prepared for this, I found a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is an astrophysicist.
Mhm.
And in the quote, he talks about how important empathy is and about how we should teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and empathy. And so this is somebody who's been staring at the marvelous creation in the stars. And the conclusion he's coming to about empathy is that it should be taught early and it should be practiced frequently.
I think we also have a quote that we could pull up here that you had mentioned to me as we were thinking about what to discuss today. Do you mind just reading this quote from Dr. Maya Angelou?
I don't mind at all. She says in her bold, brassy, and for those of you who know her poem, Phenomenal Woman, she declares phenomenally that I think we all have empathy. We may not have enough courage to display it. And so she points her finger at the core of who we are as human beings, which essentially we are made out of love. Things go awry. And so she's saying that we have the capability deep down in there somewhere. The issue is, do you have the courage to pull it out and to demonstrate it?
This reminds me very much about what you were saying earlier about courageous vulnerability, and just I think it speaks to the importance of empathy being an action or an act rather than just a private sentiment. I guess if I feel empathy, it's not worth a whole lot unless I'm willing to display it, right?
Yes, absolutely. The action's important. The capacity to be empathic is important, but it ought to catapult you towards something meaningful, whatever that is for you or other people. But it ought to show.
We do have some questions that touch on this that I want to make sure we have time for.
Okay.
One of them is, do you think that courageous vulnerability could be misunderstood as a weakness, or does that end up happening?
Of course it can. I mean, that's why I started off with the conversation about unintended consequences and collateral damage. And so it can absolutely be misunderstood. But understand one thing, and I think I differentiate between the two. Acts of inclusion are powerful. So even though you might misunderstand, when I act congruently, in other words, I am behaving in a way that is consistent with how I'm thinking and feeling, more often than not, that act of inclusion is going to produce a result. It's going to produce a shift in somebody's attitude or thought or idea. And that's what you're ultimately looking for, not somebody who's going to look at it for its surface effect and come to a conclusion that is misguided.
So we have a couple more questions here I want to get to. If you're watching this and you have a question that you'd like us to address, please go ahead and put that in the comments and we'll do our best to get to it. There's a question here. How can we teach empathy? Do you have advice for individuals or organizations?
Absolutely. You teach empathy by practicing empathy. And so what you do is, and as a matter of fact, when you are learning how to be a consultant, that's one of the criteria, the competencies that you have to develop, accurate empathy. And so how do you teach that? You teach people how to pay attention to their insides, their feelings, their perceptions. And so you ask questions. What did you see? How did you feel? What do you think? And you can start that from as soon as your children can begin to speak. And then you can also practice it with somebody who's way above their 80s or 90s, just through asking what I call focused inquiry strategy, a strategy of questions that causes people to think and to connect with other people.
I'm just reminded that we're running a little tight on time, so if you're in the audience and we didn't get to your question, I apologize. We'll do our best to try and answer those later. Abigail, I know that we touched on so many important things in this conversation. I'm just very grateful for you for walking us through all of this. Are there things that we didn't get a chance to speak to that you would like to make sure that we mention, or anything that you want to pull out as a takeaway for people?
I want to pull out the reinvention theme that we had in the title, that everything we've talked about here is designed to equip you to reinvent. It's designed to equip you to be hopeful, to feel strong, to engage in reinvention, which is an act. And so I just want to encourage everybody to know that anybody can do this. Anybody can learn how to do this and get better at it, and to use it for your own benefit. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just ask you one more question before we close. Someone wants to know, is there a metric to measure inclusion, or how can organizations or individuals get a sense of how they're stacking up to these acts of inclusion or creating an
yes, there are several measures. We at the CCL are engaged in developing a measure ourselves because we didn't find one that we were satisfied with. And so that is probably about a month or 2 months away from being delivered. So I would say hold your horses, check back in with CCL, because we are going to have a new product that is fresh off the press that will give you information and on several things. One, curiosity, which is incredibly important around especially that blind spot. Second is equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so we'll have a scale that measures all three that you can use for conversation, for self-reflection, and so on. So we look forward to being able to share that with you.
Great. Well, Abigail, thank you again so much for making the time for this conversation. I'm grateful for you introducing us to these concepts, giving people a framework to work through. And I see that we have a comment where someone is thanking you for your courageous vulnerability in this you shared. And I just want to amplify and echo that for myself. Just very appreciative. Before I jump off the screen, to those of you watching, as we wrap up this conversation, this live stream will end. We'll start a new one on the hour at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, if that's your time zone, but in about 15 minutes. And our CEO and President John Ryan will be making some closing remarks for today's Shift Forward Virtual Leadership Conference. But we wanted to end today's sessions here with Abigail, just because there are so many powerful takeaways for you and for your organization. So just again, Abigail, thank you. And to the audience, stay with us. We'll be back with closing remarks in about 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Eric. It was great talking to you.
You as well.